What would you do if you discovered your company was hiding deadly side effects that could kill thousands, including someone from your own church? That's exactly what happened to Sarah Chen, an executive director of clinical research who uncovered manipulated drug trials and now faces an impossible choice. Take the promotion of her dreams or expose the truth. This is the story of how one woman's discovery could save countless lives, but at what cost? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel to join us and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Sarah Chen stared at the manipulated clinical trial data on her screen, her cross necklace heavy against her skin, as the statistical analysis revealed hidden cardiac deaths in Bluegen Pharma's cancer drug. Sarah Chen knelt beside her office chair, her morning prayer interrupted by the troubling numbers on her screen. "Give me wisdom," she whispered, the words from James 1:5 coming naturally to her lips as she stared at the clinical trial data. As executive director of clinical research at Bluegen Pharmaceuticals, she'd sworn to uphold scientific truth, but her faith demanded an even higher standard of integrity. The stark white walls of her corner office seemed to close in as she traced her finger across the monitor, following the carefully obscured pattern of adverse cardiac events. Outside, the setting sun painted Bluegen's glass and steel headquarters in amber hues. The same desk where she'd signed her promotion paperwork now felt like a testing ground for her principles. Sarah's muscles tensed at the sound of footsteps in the hallway, Dr. Marcus Wells' distinct stride against marble flooring. She straightened, smoothing her charcoal pencil skirt, a practiced motion that betrayed years of corporate conditioning. The statistical analysis software continued its relentless calculation, each new result confirming her fears. Working late again? Marcus appeared in her doorway, his silver hair catching the dying sunlight. He didn't wait for an invitation before entering. "The board's been impressed with your dedication since the promotion." Sarah felt her throat tighten as she minimized the spreadsheet. "The cardio-L data requires attention." She chose her words carefully, remembering Proverbs' wisdom about prudent speech. "There are patterns in the cardiac events that patterns." Marcus leaned forward. "Sarah, you've always had an eye for patterns. It's why we fast-tracked you for leadership." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "But sometimes patterns are just noise. Statistical artifacts." The air conditioning hummed overhead as Sarah's fingers found the small cross at her neck. On her desk, a framed photo from last month's company leadership retreat stood next to a smaller frame with the words from John 8:32. The truth that would set her free felt more like a burden in this moment. "Dr. Wells," she began carefully, "the cardiac complications in Group C have been systematically recategorized. If we submit this data to the FDA, if we submit this data," Marcus interrupted, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "we'll be helping thousands of cancer patients. You've seen the efficacy numbers." He paused, studying her face. "The board meeting is Thursday. VP of Research Operations is opening up. Your name has been mentioned." Sarah's hand moved from her cross to her mouse, hovering over the folder containing her analysis. Like Daniel facing his own ethical dilemma, she had already taken precautions: one copy of the true data safely stored in her apartment safe, another in a sealed envelope with her pastor. "Sleep on it," Marcus said, rising smoothly. "We'll discuss the details over breakfast tomorrow. 7 am, Capitol Grill." He stopped at the door, turning back with an expression of paternal concern. "You know, Sarah, faith is admirable. But sometimes we need to look at the bigger picture. Think about all the lives we could save." The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed through the empty floor. Sarah remained motionless, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from her office walls. In the gathering darkness, she opened her Bible app, seeking guidance in familiar verses about standing firm in faith. The statistical software chimed, its final analysis complete. Sarah stared at the results, numbers swimming before her eyes. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in the quiet of her office, with only God and her conscience as witnesses, she began to document everything. The weight of Matthew 5:37, "Let your yes be yes, and your no be no," settled over her as she typed, knowing that sometimes the hardest choices were also the clearest. Sarah sat in the dimly lit church basement, her Bible study group's discussion of Daniel echoing against concrete walls. Her fingers traced the familiar passage Daniel 6:10 about praying despite the king's decree. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shifting shadows across the circle of folding chairs. Daniel chose God's law over man's law, Pastor Mike's voice carried weight tonight. He faced the lions rather than compromise. Sarah's mind wandered to Daniel's story, not just his courage in the den, but the days before, when he must have paced his chambers, knowing each prayer could mean death. Like her, he had held a privileged position, trusted by those in power. Like her, he had uncovered corruption that threatened to devour the innocent. Her fingers traced the Bible's worn pages, remembering how Daniel's enemies had used his faith against him, just as Marcus now wielded her Christian compassion as a weapon, painting scientific integrity as a barrier to mercy. The weekly Bible study suddenly felt like a mirror to her own trial, not a den of lions, but a boardroom of sharks, each waiting to see if she would bow to corporate pressure or stand firm in her convictions. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like the whispers of ancient conspirators, and she wondered if Daniel had felt the same hollow ache in his chest, knowing that doing right meant hurting those who trusted him. Sarah's laptop bag pressed against her leg, heavy with documented irregularities from Cardiozel's trials. The weight felt like both burden and armor. Her phone buzzed, another message from Marcus about tomorrow's board presentation. She silenced it without looking. Across the room, Ellen Thompson dabbed her eyes while sharing updates about her stage 4 cancer. "The new drug trial at Bluegen, it's my last hope," she whispered. "My doctor says it could be revolutionary." Sarah's chest tightened. The statistical manipulation she'd uncovered flashed through her mind: a 23% increased risk of fatal cardiac events, carefully obscured beneath layers of selective data presentation. She watched Ellen's teenage daughter squeeze her mother's hand, hope bright in both their eyes. Later that night, in her apartment's home office, Sarah spread her evidence across the desk. Her Bible lay open beside clinical trial reports, the verse about being wise as serpents and innocent as doves underlined in blue ink. The city lights twinkled beyond her window, each point of brightness representing lives that could be affected by her decision. Her computer chimed with an email from Marcus. "Final review tomorrow. Remember our discussion about the greater good. Your promotion paperwork is ready." Sarah opened her prayer journal, pen hovering over blank pages. The faces of her colleagues floated before her: researchers who trusted her judgment, lab technicians who followed her protocols. Then Ellen's hopeful expression superimposed itself, followed by the stark numbers from Group C's cardiac events. "Lord," she wrote, her handwriting unsteady, "Daniel had his lion's den. But he didn't have to watch the lions devour others first." Her phone lit up with texts from her Bible study group, prayers and encouragement about her upcoming presentation. They didn't know she was their Daniel, their Esther, standing in the gap. Or that tomorrow she would have to choose between being seen as the destroyer of hope or the betrayer of truth. Sarah closed her journal and opened her laptop. As midnight approached, she began drafting 2 documents. A resignation letter and a detailed report for the FDA. Outside her window, a church bell tolled, its clear notes carrying through the night air, marking time's passage and the weight of decisions yet to come. The cross on her wall cast a long shadow in the desk lamp's light. Sarah remembered her grandmother's words about character being built in the dark hours. Tonight, in the space between corporate ambition and moral conviction, between hope and truth, she would find out what kind of character she truly possessed. The fluorescent lit server room hummed at 2 a.m., casting a sickly glow across Sarah's face as she reviewed another batch of trial data. The rhythmic whir of cooling fans masked her keystrokes, each click potentially alerting its security. Like Nicodemus seeking truth in the night, she'd chosen this hour carefully when even the most dedicated employees had gone home. "You're not as subtle as you think." Sarah's heart lurched. A figure emerged from between the server racks, tall, gaunt, with tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. James Barrett, its systems manager, someone she'd only nodded to in hallways. "The logs show you've been accessing historical trial data for 3 weeks now." His voice carried no accusation, only a bone-deep weariness, like that of the watchman waiting for morning. "During off hours. From different terminals. Amateur mistake, by the way." Sarah's fingers hovered over her laptop's power button. I have clearance to access current trials, yes. Not archive data from 2023. James leaned against a server rack. Specifically, not the Vecepta trial data. The name hung in the air like incense in a temple. Sarah remembered reading about Vecepta's rushed approval, the subsequent recall. The mysterious death of a patient's rights advocate who'd raised concerns. My wife participated in that trial, James said quietly. Terminal breast cancer. They said it was her best hope. His laugh held no humor. Turns out hope can stop a heart just as effectively as bad medicine. Sarah closed her laptop slowly. The CardioZL data shows similar patterns. I know. James pulled a USB drive from his pocket. I've been watching the data manipulation in real time. Server logs, deleted files, amended reports, it's all here. But you'll need help accessing it without leaving digital fingerprints. Through the server room's small window, the city's lights blurred like stars guiding wise men. Sarah studied James' face, seeing her own moral exhaustion mirrored there. Why help me? Because Claire, my wife, she believed in prayer and science equally. Said they were both ways of seeking truth. James' voice cracked slightly. Before she died, she made me promise to protect that truth, whatever the cost. Sarah thought of Ellen Thompson's hopeful face at Bible study, of Marcus's smooth justifications, of Daniel's lonely nights before the lion's den. Like Esther approaching the king's throne, she reached for the USB drive. Show me everything. The servers hummed their electronic hymn as two unlikely allies began their dangerous dance with truth, faith, and justice. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky, promising either revelation or reckoning, like the morning star heralding a new day. Sarah's office glowed with spreadsheet light as she cross-referenced clinical data against James Barrett's server logs. Like a modern-day scroll of truth, the numbers told a damning story. The CardioZL manipulation wasn't isolated, it was just the latest chapter in a longer narrative of deception. Look at this pattern, James whispered, his finger tracing across her monitor. They'd taken to meeting during lunch hours, their heads bent together over data like scribes decoding ancient texts. The same statistical smoothing algorithm appears in the Vecepta trials, the Neurogen studies, even the CardioFix submissions from 2023. Sarah's stomach tightened as she recognized Marcus's digital fingerprints across years of trials. The familiar statistical sleight of hand that had first caught her attention with CardioZL now revealed itself in study after study, like a serpent's trail through Eden. They're clever, James continued, his voice bitter with memory. They bury the adverse events in subgroup analyses, split the control groups to dilute the significance. Most reviewers wouldn't catch it unless they knew exactly where to look. The weight of discovery pressed down like stones. Sarah thought of the thousands of patients who'd taken these drugs, trusting in the science, believing in the promise of healing. Her cross felt heavy against her chest as she documented each manipulation, each hidden risk. Claire started showing symptoms 3 weeks into the Vecepta trial, James said quietly, staring at a particularly damning dataset. By the time we realized something was wrong, he trailed off, adjusting his glasses to hide the moisture in his eyes. They worked methodically, gathering evidence like gleaners in a corrupt field. Sarah maintained her public compliance, attending board meetings with practiced smiles, while James built secure backdoors into the company's servers. Each discovery felt like another seal broken on a book of revelations, email threads discussing data optimization, buried reports of adverse events, internal memos, calculating acceptable risk ratios against profit margins. The truth grew like a mustard seed, small but unstoppable. By night, Sarah prayed for guidance, for protection, for the strength to see this through. By day, she and James pieced together the puzzle of corruption, knowing that each piece of evidence they gathered was both sword and shield. In the quiet of their clandestine meetings, surrounded by the soft whir of computers and the weight of truth, Sarah understood why the prophets of old often stood alone. But like Elijah finding his 7,000, she had found an ally in this modern wilderness of corporate greed. The servers hummed their constant rhythm as two modern-day witnesses compiled their testimony, knowing that soon they would have to choose between remaining in the shadows or stepping into the light of truth. Marcus's hand on Sarah's shoulder felt like Judas's kiss. "You've been putting in long hours lately," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "The board is impressed with your dedication." Sarah forced herself to remain still, though her pulse quickened. On her laptop screen, a harmless spreadsheet masked the encrypted folder containing 6 weeks of damning evidence. The morning sun streamed through her office windows, casting long shadows across her desk like prison bars. "Just ensuring everything's perfect for the FDA submission," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The cross at her neck felt like it burned against her skin. The past weeks had become an elaborate dance of deception. Each morning, Sarah attended strategy meetings, nodding at the right moments, while James worked invisibly in the background, tracking digital footprints through BlueGen servers. Their evidence had grown like a hidden treasure, buried deep in encrypted drives. During lunch breaks, she'd meet James in the server room, their whispered conversations masked by the hum of machinery. "They're getting suspicious," he'd warned yesterday, showing her the increased security protocols on her access logs. "It's been asked to monitor certain employees more closely." Now, as Marcus lingered by her desk, Sarah noticed the subtle changes: the security guard's longer glances, the sudden routine system audits, the way her colleagues' conversations stopped when she entered the break room. Like David in Saul's court, she felt the weight of watching eyes. "The presentation to the investors next week," Marcus said, drumming his fingers on her desk. "I trust you'll have good news to share." "Of course," Sarah smiled, the lie bitter on her tongue. In her purse, a USB drive contained evidence that would shatter not just CardioZell's approval chances, but potentially BlueGen's entire research division. After Marcus left, Sarah sent a coded message to James. Psalm 56:7. Their agreed signal that they were running out of time. The sun had set by the time Sarah packed up her desk, carefully arranging papers like any other day. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed with a text from James. Server room. Midnight. Found something big. The parking lot security camera tracked her departure, its red light blinking like an unblinking eye in the gathering darkness. Sarah gripped her steering wheel, knowing that tomorrow would bring either salvation or sacrifice. Like the prophets of old, she could feel the storm gathering. But first, she had an appointment with truth at midnight. The framed photo of Claire Barrett stared at Sarah from James' desk, young, vibrant, smiling at her wedding day. "She lasted 6 weeks after the first cardiac episode," James whispered, his voice raw in the emptied office. "I keep thinking, if someone had spoken up sooner." Sarah watched James' hands tremble as he typed, his wedding ring catching the blue light of multiple monitors. Their investigation had reached a critical mass, but the personal cost was beginning to show. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his usual methodical approach had gained an edge of desperate intensity. The past week had brought them closer to the truth, but also closer to breaking. James would freeze whenever they uncovered patient data matching Claire's demographic. Each cardiac event report seemed to resurrect his grief, turning clinical statistics into haunting memories. "She believed in BlueGen," he said, pulling up another dataset. "Even at the end, she defended them. Said they were trying to help people." His bitter laugh echoed against server walls. "Now I see her in every manipulated number, every hidden side effect." Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder as error messages flashed across their screens. Their latest attempt to access the legacy database had triggered new security protocols. Like walls closing in, their digital pathways were being systematically blocked. "They're watching everything now," James muttered, his fingers flying across keyboards. "New firewalls, access restrictions, surveillance software." He glanced at Claire's photo. "They're using the same playbook they used during the SEPTA." The weight of their mission pressed down like stones. Sarah's phone buzzed with another message from Pastor Mike, asking about the concerns some congregation members had raised about her role at BlueGen. The company's tendrils reached deeper than she'd imagined. James suddenly straightened, his face pale. "Sarah, look at this." He pointed to a string of code. "They're not just monitoring us. They're building a case. Employee records, access logs, psychological profiles." His voice cracked. "Just like they did with the last whistleblower before Vesepta." The office felt smaller, darker. Sarah's cross pressed against her throat as she read the documents. Their time was running out, but James' grief-driven determination had made him reckless. Like a man with nothing left to lose. "We need to be smarter than I was with Claire," James said, shutting down the systems. "They're expecting a frontal assault. We need to be serpents in the garden." As they left the office separately, following their careful protocol, Sarah saw James touch his wife's photo one last time. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight she had to figure out how to save both the truth and the broken man fighting for it. The security camera tracked their departures, its red light steady and patient. In the parking lot, Sarah's phone lit up with a message from Marcus. "Board meeting moved up. Tomorrow morning. Bring your final recommendations." The game was changing, and they weren't the only ones making moves in the dark. The board meeting room felt like a modern-day Sanhedrin. Sarah's presentation on Cardiozel's final recommendations lay untouched before her, while Marcus's words hung in the air. "We're implementing new security protocols. For everyone's protection, of course." The morning sun through floor-to-ceiling windows cast her shadow long across the polished table. 14 pairs of eyes studied her with the same intensity she'd once studied scripture, searching for signs of betrayal. Her recent dedication had not gone unnoticed. Within days, the isolation began. Her security clearance was upgraded, restricting her to specific floors. Her team meetings were rescheduled without notice, her direct reports reassigned to streamline operations. Like water draining from a pool, her influence ebbed away. "It's standard procedure," Marcus assured her, his smile sharp as a sword. "We're compartmentalizing sensitive data before the FDA submission." But Sarah noticed the new cameras in the corridors, the audits of her computer, the security guard who now patrolled her floor with suspicious regularity. Lunch became a solitary affair. Colleagues who once sought her counsel now hurried past with averted eyes. Her office, once a hub of activity, became a glass cage where every keystroke felt monitored. Even the cleaning staff had been replaced with unfamiliar faces. "They're building a narrative," James warned during one of their increasingly rare meetings, this time in the parking garage where cameras had blind spots. "HR is documenting everything: your hours, your access patterns, your communications." Sarah found her name removed from key project emails, her input no longer sought on critical decisions. Like Joseph's brothers stripping away his coat of many colors, they were systematically removing her authority, piece by piece. The final stroke came on a Friday. Sarah arrived to find her office relocated to the third floor, away from the research division. Her window now faced a brick wall instead of the city skyline. On her new desk, a single post-it note read, "Meeting with legal on Monday. Routine review." That evening, as security cameras tracked her departure, Sarah's phone lit up with a message from Ellen Thompson. "After Bible study tonight, we need to talk. The whole congregation is worried about what we've been hearing." Sarah gripped her steering wheel, remembering how Daniel had walked to the lion's den with his head held high. But Daniel hadn't had to watch the lions devour the innocent first. And now, like Job's comforters, her own church family was gathering to question her righteousness. The setting sun painted Blue Gen's glass towers blood red as Sarah drove away, her rearview mirror showing 2 security vehicles pulling out behind her. The shepherd saw him echoed in her mind walking through the valley of shadows. But tonight, those shadows wore corporate badges and carried surveillance reports. The security vehicles melted away as Sarah pulled into Grace Community Church's parking lot, but the weight of being watched remained. Ellen Thompson stood at the entrance, her gaunt frame illuminated by fluorescent lights, no longer the hopeful cancer patient from weeks ago. "You're working to stop Cardiozel, aren't you?" Ellen's accusation carried across the empty lot. Behind her, several church members lingered after Bible study, their whispers like dry leaves in the wind. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest. These were her people, her community for 6 years. Now they looked at her like the crowds must have looked at Jeremiah the prophet who dared to speak uncomfortable truths. "Ellen, the situation is complicated." Ellen's voice cracked. "My oncologist says Cardiozel could give me 2 more years with my daughter." "What's complicated about that?" The small group by the church doors grew larger. Sarah recognized faces from her prayer group, the worship team, the women's ministry. Some couldn't meet her eyes. Others stared with open hostility. "I heard she's trying to sabotage the trials," someone whispered. "All those years of research, all that hope for cancer patients, my cousin works at BlueGen," another voice added. "Says she's become obsessed, seeing conspiracies everywhere." The church fellowship hall, once her sanctuary, had become a courtroom. Sarah watched as Linda, her prayer partner of 3 years, pulled her teenage daughter away when Sarah approached. The girl who had called her Aunt Sarah now looked at her with confusion and hurt. "We pray for miracles," Ellen continued, tears streaming down her face, "and when God provides a path through BlueGen, you want to block it. How is that Christian?" Sarah felt each word like a stone. The data proving cardiocel's dangers burned in her mind, cardiac failures hidden in spreadsheets, lives reduced to acceptable risk percentages. But how could she explain that to people who saw only hope? The church door opened again. Pastor Mike stepped out, his expression troubled as he surveyed the scene. "Sarah," he called, "I think we need to talk." Behind him, the church bulletin board displayed this week's sermon topic: faith, science, and God's healing power. Sarah's own testimony about being a Christian in the pharmaceutical industry, printed just months ago in the church newsletter, was still pinned there, yellowing at the edges. As she walked toward Pastor Mike's office, Sarah heard Ellen's daughter asking, "Mom, why is Ms. Chen trying to stop your medicine?" The question followed her like a shadow, mixing with the memory of James' words about his wife Claire, about truth and consequences, about the cost of silence. The cross above Pastor Mike's door caught the evening light, casting a long shadow across the hallway. Like Peter walking toward his denial, Sarah stepped into the growing darkness, knowing that harder choices still lay ahead. Pastor Mike's office felt smaller than Sarah remembered, the walls lined with theological texts that once offered comfort, now loomed like silent judges. The cross she'd helped mount years ago cast intersecting shadows across his desk, where BlueGen's latest press release about cardiocel lay open. "Your name came up at the elders' meeting," Pastor Mike began, his gentle voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "Several families are concerned about your position on the trial." Sarah's fingers found her own cross necklace as she sat, the metal warm against her skin. Through the window, she could see Ellen Thompson being consoled by church members in the parking lot, their heads bowed in what looked like prayer. "We're called to be healers, Sarah," Pastor Mike continued, opening his Bible to the Gospel of Luke. "Jesus didn't withhold healing because of bureaucratic concerns. He didn't file reports about potential side effects." The comparison struck her like a physical blow. "This isn't about bureaucracy," Sarah's voice trembled. "People could die, people are dying now," he interrupted, gesturing toward the window. "Ellen has weeks, maybe months. This drug represents hope. Real, tangible hope." He leaned forward, his face softening. "Sometimes we let perfect be the enemy of good." Even Moses struck the rock in anger, thinking he knew better than God's plan. Sarah thought of James' wife Claire, of the hidden data showing cardiac failures, of Marcus's smooth justifications. The weight of truth pressed down like Gethsemane's burden. "What if the hope is false?" she whispered. "What if silence makes us complicit?" Pastor Mike's eye carried years of pastoral wisdom. "The church board is concerned about your involvement with the youth ministry. Parents are asking questions. Your testimony about faith and science was powerful, but now," he spread his hands helplessly, "you're becoming a source of division." The evening light faded, leaving them in growing shadow. Outside, the last cars were leaving the parking lot, headlights sweeping across empty spaces like searching eyes. "Sometimes God's path isn't the one that feels righteous," Pastor Mike said softly. "Sometimes it's the one that brings healing, even if the process isn't perfect." Sarah stood, her decision crystallizing like dew in the desert. "Or sometimes," she replied, her voice finding strength, "we're called to be Daniel, not Darius. To stand for truth, even when it costs us everything." As she reached for the door, Pastor Mike called after her. "Sarah, the congregation needs unity right now. They need hope. Don't let pride turn you into a stumbling block." The word pride echoed down the darkened church hallway as Sarah's phone lit up with James' message. "Security breach detected. They know." Her hands trembled as she slumped against the cold church wall, the weight of isolation pressing down like the stone before Christ's tomb. In the empty sanctuary, moonlight filtered through stained glass, casting fractured colors across empty pews. Sarah found herself drawn to the altar where she'd once felt so certain of God's path. Now, like Job stripped of everything but his faith, she knelt in the gathering darkness. The evidence of Cardiozel's dangers sat heavily in her bag, while Ellen Thompson's desperate hope haunted her thoughts. Each heartbeat seemed to whisper accusations. Pride, betrayal, destruction. The congregation's rejection stung like thorns, transforming her spiritual home into another wilderness to wander. Her prayer began as a whisper, breaking against marble floors. The same floors where she'd once taught Sunday school, where she'd counseled young scientists about integrating faith and career, where she'd testified about God's purpose in her work at BlueGen. Now those memories felt like stones weighing down her soul. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Marcus this time. My office, 7 a.m. tomorrow. One last chance to make things right. The words glowed in the darkness like serpent's eyes, offering an easier path, a way to restore everything she was losing. She touched her cross necklace, remembering how Peter had denied Christ 3 times before the rooster crowed. The choice loomed before her. Deny the truth and keep her world intact, or embrace it and lose everything. The sanctuary's silence offered no answer, only the weight of consequence. Rising from her knees, Sarah saw her reflection in the darkened windows, a solitary figure in a vast space, like the prophets of old facing their moments of truth. Tomorrow would bring Marcus's offer of redemption or damnation, but tonight her fractured faith had finally found its bedrock. The security cameras tracked her exit from the church parking lot, their red lights blinking like distant warning beacons. The dawn painted BlueGen's executive floor in shades of Judgment Day orange as Sarah stepped out of the elevator at 6:55 a.m. Marcus's corner office loomed ahead, its glass walls reflecting the rising sun like flames. Inside, Marcus Wells stood silhouetted against the city skyline, his silver hair catching the light like a false halo. Sarah, he turned, gesturing to the leather chair across his desk. I'm glad you came early. We have much to discuss. The office temperature felt too cold, the leather too smooth, the silence too complete. Sarah's cross pressed against her collarbone as she sat, aware of the USB drive in her bag containing their gathered evidence. You've always been one of our brightest stars, Marcus began, sliding a folder across his polished desk. VP of Research Operations. Full equity partnership. A seat on the board. His smile carried the weight of promised kingdoms. Think of the good you could do with that kind of influence. Sarah's fingers traced the folder's edge but didn't open it. Through the glass walls, she could see the hospital where Ellen Thompson received her treatments, where Claire Barrett had spent her final days. Your faith has always been admirable, Marcus continued, his voice softening. But sometimes compassion means making difficult choices. Moses had to break the tablets to save his people. David ate the consecrated bread to feed his men. He leaned forward, his cologne carrying notes of cedar and authority. How many Ellen Thompsons are out there, Sarah? How many desperate prayers could we answer? The morning sun crept across the desk between them, illuminating the contract's golden letterhead. Sarah thought of Jesus in the wilderness, offered all the kingdoms of the world for a simple compromise. The FDA submission is ready, Marcus said. All it needs is your signature. Your blessing. He paused, letting the word hang between them. Or your curse. Sarah's phone vibrated in her bag, probably James, warning her about new security protocols, about the net closing in. The city stretched below them, filled with people who would never know they were being offered as sacrifices on the altar of profit. Marcus checked his watch. The board meets at noon. Think of it as your own road to Damascus moment, Sarah. A chance to see things in a new light. The morning sun had reached Sarah's chair, warming her back like an urging hand. The choice before her would reshape not just her future, but the lives of thousands. And somewhere in the building's server room, James waited with their evidence, ready to become either salvation or damnation. The city's church bells began to toll 7, their bronze voices carrying judgment or mercy, depending on what she would choose in the next 5 hours. The church bells faded as Sarah found refuge in BlueGen's rooftop garden, a corporate Eden 17 stories above the city. Here, among carefully manicured plants and recycled air, she had 1 hour before the board meeting would seal thousands of fates. The morning sun cast her shadow long across empty benches where employees usually took their lunch breaks. Now, like Jesus in Gethsemane, she sat alone among the greenery, the weight of her decision pressing down like a crown of thorns. Her phone displayed the evidence James had compiled. Spreadsheets of cardiac events, hidden trial data, internal emails discussing acceptable losses. Each number represented a life: parents, children, spouses. She thought of Ellen Thompson's daughter, praying for a miracle that might become her mother's execution. The garden's fountain murmured like distant voices as Sarah opened her Bible app to Matthew 26. Her finger traced the words on the screen. "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." The promotion package Marcus offered sat unopened in her bag, a devil's bargain printed on golden letterhead. James' message lit up her screen. "Security's looking for you. Whatever you decide, destroy the backup drive." Like Peter in the courtyard, he was watching from afar, waiting to see if she would deny the truth to save herself. The fountain spray caught the sunlight, creating momentary rainbows that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Like the promises Marcus had offered: influence, power, the chance to shape research from the inside. All she had to do was look away, just this once. Her cross felt heavy against her skin as she stood, watching her shadow stretch toward the boardroom floor where Marcus waited. The choice crystallized like dew on the garden's leaves, not between right and wrong, but between comfortable silence and costly truth. Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. Marcus. Board meeting moved up. 30 minutes. Time to choose your side. Below his message, a text from Ellen Thompson. "Praying for you to do the right thing." The garden's gate closed behind her with the finality of a sealing tomb. But as Sarah walked toward the elevator, her steps carried the weight of resurrection: death to her old life, perhaps, but rebirth in truth. The boardroom lights blazed through glass walls like an approaching storm. Sarah touched her cross one last time, thinking of another garden, another choice, another moment when truth and power collided. The evidence in her bag felt like stones ready for casting. The elevator doors opened to the executive floor, where Marcus waited with his offer of 30 pieces of silver. Behind him, through the windows, the morning sun blazed like a burning bush, calling her to holy ground. The boardroom doors parted like the Red Sea as Sarah entered, her evidence clutched like tablets of stone. Morning sunlight streamed through floor to ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table where 12 board members sat in judgment. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his silver hair gleaming, PowerPoint presentation ready with manipulated data. His smile faltered as Sarah walked not to her assigned seat, but to the podium. "Before we begin," Sarah's voice carried the quiet strength of prophets, "I'd like to present some additional data." She nodded to James, who had positioned himself by the room's controls. Screens flickered to life, displaying the true Cardio's L numbers in stark relief. "These are the actual trial results," Sarah continued, each slide revealing Marcus's systematic deception. Not just for Cardio's L, but Septa, Neurogen, and 5 other trials spanning the past decade. The board members' murmurs grew like gathering storm clouds as Marcus's face darkened. "This is a breach of protocol," Sarah interrupted. "Like manipulating trial data. Like exploiting my faith to justify hiding cardiac deaths." Her voice trembled not with fear but righteous anger. "Like using Ellen Thompson's desperation as emotional leverage." The evidence mounted like waves. Internal emails, altered statistics, buried reports. Marcus attempted to reach the podium, but Sarah's next words froze him mid-stride. "But this isn't about destruction. It's about redemption." The screens shifted to display a comprehensive reform proposal. Behind her, James began distributing documents to the board members' signatures from department heads, ethical researchers, and regulatory experts, all supporting her plan. "We have an opportunity," Sarah's voice softened, "to lead our industry in ethical reform. To prove that profit and principle can coexist." Marcus's last attempt at control shattered as his own emails appeared on screen, messages exploiting Sarah's faith, twisting scripture to justify corruption. The board chairman's face hardened with each revelation. "Dr. Wells," the chairman's voice cut through the tension, I believe it's time for your resignation." As security arrived to escort Marcus out, he turned to Sarah with defeated eyes. "You've destroyed everything." "No," Sarah replied, touching her cross. "I'm offering a chance for rebuilding. The same chance I'm offering BlueGen." The sun had fully risen now, its light transforming the boardroom into something like a sanctuary. As Marcus was led away, Sarah began outlining her vision for reform, knowing that sometimes the hardest path led not to destruction, but to transformation. Her phone buzzed one final time, a message from Ellen Thompson. "Just heard the news. Praying for all of you." The board meeting continued, but something had already shifted in the air, like the first breath of spring after a long winter, promising renewal and restoration. 6 months later, sunlight streamed through the renovated BlueGen lobby where a new mission statement gleamed. Truth, ethics, innovation. Sarah watched employees scan their badges through upgraded security protocols, each clearance level now requiring dual verification for trial data access. In the oncology wing, Ellen Thompson sat in a treatment chair, her daughter holding her hand, while Dr. Patterson, the new head of clinical trials, explained the latest results. "The reformed Cardios-L trial is showing promising results," he said, with full transparency about both benefits and risks. Sarah touched her cross, remembering the day the new oversight committee had first convened. Now, each trial had multiple independent reviewers, and a whistleblower protection program bore her name, though she tried to decline the honor. "Quite a change," James' voice came from behind her. He looked different now, lighter somehow. The grief in his eyes had softened since the ethics board had implemented the Claire Barrett protocol for cardiac monitoring in all trials. "Claire would be proud," Sarah said softly. "She would be proud of you," James replied, adjusting his new badge that read Head of Data Integrity. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Sarah made her way to her weekly meeting, not in a boardroom, but in a small office on the ground floor. Marcus sat waiting, his silver hair now touched with more gray, his designer suit replaced by business casual attire. "The ethics committee reviewed your proposal," Sarah said, setting down a folder. "They're impressed with your insights on implementing faith-based ethical frameworks in corporate governance." Marcus nodded, touching a small cross pin on his lapel, new, like his humility. "I've been reading a lot," he said quietly. "About servant leadership. About using power to protect, not profit." Later that evening, Sarah stood before her church congregation, not as an outcast, but as a testimony. Pastor Mike had asked her to share how faith had guided her through the crisis. Ellen Thompson sat in the front row, her color better, her smile genuine. "Faith isn't just about personal salvation," Sarah began, her voice carrying to the rafters. "It's about transforming the world we're given into the world God envisions." The setting sun painted the stained glass windows in shades of hope. On Sarah's desk, back at the office, a new plaque sat beside her Bible. "Where there is darkness, let me sow light." The next generation of trials would begin tomorrow, built on foundations of truth and transparency. But tonight, in this sanctuary of second chances, Sarah understood that sometimes the greatest miracles weren't the ones you prayed for, but the ones you were called to create.